All right. So thank you for having me here for your meeting. As mentioned already, my talk is going to look at what we can learn from Hurricane Michael about the economics of disaster recovery, particularly sort of the mid-range efforts where, and this is what drives my interest, where philanthropy has a pretty significant role. So I'm David Berlan. I'm an associate professor in the Askew School of Public Administration and Policy, but I'm primarily, I view myself as a nonprofit management person. I study the nonprofit sector, I study organizations in it, and then sort of their efforts into the broader community economy, et cetera. In this, today what I'm going to talk about, I'll give a sort of a brief recap of what Hurricane Michael was like for those of us who've forgotten since of all the other disasters that have hit in between. What the research project I was working on in the wake of it, which was really trying to be the most comprehensive map of regional and local philanthropy after a hurricane. What I've learned from that about the different stages of recovery and where sort of civil society and the other sectors fit in the recovery. What we learned about disaster philanthropy from this, and then a few thoughts and sort of some ideas about broader economic impacts and how we look at generally how we're helping communities recover or what goes in. All right, so Hurricane Michael, as most of you know, and sort of if you've come here since 2018, it made landfall on October 10th as a Category 5 hurricane. It covered a significant portion of the area near us, what we call the Forgotten Coast in much of the Big Bend, with Panama City Beach being sort of one of the main areas, the largest population centers that was hit heavily, or not Panama City Beach, Panama City. Mexico Beach is sort of the place where the real sort of target landfall hit. This was the strongest storm on record to hit Florida's Panhandle, and had a huge impact, but was a mostly rural area that was hit by the storm. If we look at just some top level comparisons to other storms that happened around the same time, NOAA was estimating that Michael did about $25 billion worth of damages. The most comparable one to it perhaps was Florence that hit that same year, was estimated to do about 24 billion in damages. And we see sort of earlier figures on FEMA assistance for about $640 million to Hurricane Michael. This is dwarfed by a couple of the larger storms like Irma or Harvey, which Irma had about twice the estimated damages, but about 4 times the FEMA assistance, at least that early estimate, but was spread out over a much larger population of households. If we see sort of the largest philanthropic actor, the Red Cross, we also see that donations were pretty small for Michael from sort of the broader community, the nation, compared to some of these other disasters. More comparable to the assistance that was given to the Red Cross for efforts in Maria in Puerto Rico than to any of the other sort of domestic storms. This may be due to timing. It was sort of a weird timing for when it hit. It hit here right afterwards. There were wildfires in California. There was a midterm election going on. So you do have some other dynamics that were drawing attention that quickly took it off the media map, and it might explain some of the sort of lack of attention. If, I've tried to figure out what this means and what this looks like for the different regions that were impacted. I've looked at sort of the 12 Florida counties that were most impacted. And we have some interesting perspectives on it from this. One of the things that was interesting to me is because this is a heavily forested area of Florida, just the cost of hauling debris was a burden on many of the counties. I just compared the estimates of what the debris cost to haul to what each of those counties' government budget for a year was, and saw that in 2 of the counties, it exceeded their budget. In Jackson, it was almost 5 times their annual county budget. And even in Bay County, which has a somewhat more sizable budget than the others, it was about 72% of their annual budget. So clearly sort of a cost that could not be borne just by the local government, local community. One of the other ways to look at how broad spread the impact was were the percentage of households that needed an inspection from FEMA for the impact and decide whether they would get assistance. Bay County, about 2/3 of households were inspected, but both Calhoun and Gulf actually had higher rates of people being inspected. And there were 2 other counties that almost right around half, in Jackson and Liberty, of households were inspected. And then I tried to take a look at this federal funding per impacted household and saw that at the top level, where we're seeing the coastal communities tending to get a bit more, which makes sense. Things like storm surge can have a larger impact per house, but it quickly dropped off as we moved it inland. So what I was really looking into, what my research was focusing on, was really trying to capture the voluntary responses to Hurricane Michael. So how organizations, not individuals, but organizations, get involved in providing donated assistance, whether that's labor, goods, cash, hoping to develop guidance for how we respond to disasters in the future. And I was, in particular, trying to have an approach that was coming from the grassroots up. So going out into the field, sort of looking at the bottom level, rather than starting with the formal organizations that are usually tasked with coordinating this type of assistance. And really, I was paying particular attention to what factors characterize organizations that elect to donate a specific form of post-disaster aid, was sort of one of the 2 projects pulling from it. The other is really looking at the place for civil society in emergency response. And what we've known before is that local governments tend to rely on voluntary organizations for assistance after disasters. They aren't able to do it all themselves. They rely heavily on either sort of more formalized organizations that are used to responding, or the efforts of their broader local community to assist. And we see this happening from every sector. This is not just something nonprofits do, it's something religious congregations do. It's something that locally based and even regional, sometimes even national corporations do as well. Neighboring governments will provide assistance. It's sort of after a disaster, this is one of those things where all sorts of organizations and people get involved and respond. And what you see is that they'll take on new activities, they'll shift to meet increased demands for their services, and sometimes they'll even create new nonprofits to try to help provide assistance. This can get tricky though. Emergency management professionals find spontaneous volunteers, so sort of volunteers that are unorganized or that are done through non-traditional venues, and groups that provide in-kind assistance, so donated supplies, donated services. They often find these to be more of a challenge than a useful resource that can really be put to their advantage. And so I've been looking into sort of starting at thinking about organizational identity as what drives organizations to respond, really thinking about who they are as an organization, what, how closely related their mission is to emergency management, and then whether this would lead them to take a particular form of donation that they're going to get involved in. And so what I did to do this research is I took a mixed methods approach, which for economics graduate students is probably going to be quite different than what you traditionally do. This meant that we were out in the field. We were visiting organizations, we were visiting individuals, we held information sessions, sort of went out in person. So we took 27 visits to the field, and we identified and got 225 organizations who were involved in some way or another to complete a survey for us, or to have it completed on their behalf as we were interviewing them and speaking with them. This was intended to be more of an inductive approach, looking what's out there, figuring out what's going on with participatory elements. So sort of having room for us to learn from the organizations, and in the process do things like connecting organizations that were disconnected from one another to each other. Part of what I did to lean into this was an action research course. This was actually a photo of sort of one of our training sessions for our group to go out and collect this data and do this work. And then we've also been building on archival research. So looking at published documents, grant and contracts approval, various things of that sort to fill in the gaps for what we didn't know from collecting this fieldwork. So the sampling approach was to reach all potential donating organizations in the region at least once. So although we had the field work for the sort of more involved organizations, and so this ends up with a weird approach, a non-traditional approach, in that we're trying to get multiple exposures to organizations that are more involved. So basically, for every network that is out there that organizations could be part of in responding to the disaster, they would see appeals from us at least once through each of those networks. So we went through different listservs, different email chains, had our field visits, we had some events to sort of recognize organizations and use that as a way of making connections. And then also did use one postcard sort of as a way to make sure we had at least one touch with every organization. And sort of really what was necessary to participate was that they had to be donating organizationally for the recovery. We included in the survey instrument a wide range of questions about the donations, how they coordinated them, why they were motivated, and whether they themselves had been impacted. I'm still trying to figure out the best way to calculate our response rate because we had multiple touches. For those who only received the postcard, we only had about a 1% response rate, whereas one of the particular listservs, we had about a 20% response rate. And yet when we compare what we've captured to what's available out there, our estimate is that we've captured at least half of all the donations that went to the community through this survey protocol. What we had in the respondents, so nonprofits were the most common from organizations, so 83 of them replied. About half as many religious congregations took our survey. Again, having it again for the number of government agencies that responded, and a small number of corporations. This is the group I think we failed to capture as effectively, in part because most of their assistance was right after the storm. And simple things like the delay in getting IRB approval meant we had less of a chance to get corporations that were still involved captured in our survey protocol. Most of the organizations were actually based here in Leon County and were out sort of working in the broader community, helping others. A large cluster in Jackson County, a smaller group in Bay, and then others were scattered elsewhere. And then most of these organizations did view it as a clear fit with their mission, although others, it wasn't. It was something new for them to be doing this type of response, but they were operating in the same community where they traditionally operate. So in our first analysis, looking at what happened, and sort of what we were seeing about how this was organized and led, my perspective of it is traditionally we talk about a couple of different phases of emergency management. So the members of the Emergency Management Association will be familiar with it. I did break out the recovery stage into 3 different pieces just because I realized it looked a little bit different. So both sort of the preparedness and the mitigation seem to be sort of the domain of disaster professionals. So those who are tasked within government agencies for doing this work, organizations where this is their specialty, that seems to be something where they're sort of solely in that realm. During the actual response, again, this is disaster professionals for those who help respond to emergencies, first responders, and those who have already become members of pre-existing networks. But then you also get clusters of what I am terming, not in a pejorative term, but it may actually be that way in some cases, a wide range of amateurs, right? From the stories of people in Liberty County where, you know, everybody in the county owns a chainsaw, so they're out there helping their neighbors get access back to their roads. things of that sort, to sort of people who, suddenly load up a truck, bring it up from Central Florida with whatever they had at hand. When we move into recovery, sort of the immediate recovery, we have organizations that are specialists in this. So we do have a range of organizations who emphasize doing recovery work. This would be things like the UMCOR, United Methodist Relief Corps, different sort of aspects of organizations that are used to sort of helping communities start to inventory how badly they were hit, what they should do to respond, how they provide assistance, and then also the regular providers of human services in a community. Homeless shelters, food kitchens, other organizations that have a track record of serving those that are hit. These groups sort of activate and take over from groups like the Red Cross and others, who then have a different role or are moving out of it. In the middle range, what we saw sort of as attention waned, as groups from outside the region stopped focusing on it, those who were keeping attention on the recovery were traditionally parts of civil society. So we see sort of, and I mean, when I say civil society, I mean both the secular nonprofit community and religious organizations. And what happened is this is where civil society takes on a greater leadership role. Emergency managers are no longer sort of involved, because it's moved into this almost gray area between emergency management and between economic development. And it's much more sort of meeting human needs, right? Social services, human services. Then what happens, and this really only happened in one of the counties to a large extent, but when they move to a model much more focused on economic development and sort of longer term recovery, what happens is sort of the smaller civil society actors, the nonprofits who have been providing assistance, the religious congregations, all but the largest of these organizations sort of get pushed out as the resources grow. And what happens is this opens up a room where elected officials take a greater interest, where the business community takes a larger interest, and suddenly you see how new, larger sort of in terms of economic size actors get involved. And if we looked at the different counties, paying particular attention to whether there were sort of new groups formed, we see some interesting dynamics. Here in Leon County, there wasn't that much of a disaster, right? The impact was something we could deal with from sort of the resources we had available in the community generally. And so there wasn't need to form a new group to address it, but there were sort of 2 new disaster funds that were hosted in Leon County that were helping the broader region. And here the real focus was on helping the other counties and meeting local needs at the same time. Bay County was a fully professionalized recovery effort. Early on, there was an effort to form what they're called a long-term recovery group. It seemed to have evaporated when Bay County sort of fully professionalized its recovery effort. Instead, it had a group that led by electals and by consultants who were doing the vast majority of the planning, the work, the coordination for what the recovery looked like. That was not the case in any of the other counties. So in 5 of them, Calhoun, Gadsden, Gulf, Jackson, and Liberty counties, they all formed these long-term recovery groups where they were mostly being led by leaders with local religious groups or with nonprofit organizations. In Holmes and Washington counties, there was delayed formation of long-term recovery groups. The Holmes County group came online close to a year after the disaster, as far as I can tell, and actually served a lot of the needs for Washington too, I believe. In Franklin and Wakulla, they never really got around to creating an organization. There were some reports of an effort to create one, but it never really happened. And instead they were using sort of existing actors to address remaining needs. And then what we saw regionally were sort of new and existing fundraising efforts. And so from this, we can learn a couple of key things about how counties respond. But again, this is a primarily rural region. You know, the sort of how transferable these findings are is something that I would need to figure out and test and look in other contexts. But we see that nonprofit and religious leaders take on substantial leadership roles, especially in smaller counties. In asking donors about how they got involved, we saw that generosity was motivated by the awareness of the storm's impact rather than being asked, but that a lot of challenges and needs remain and actually are still in place, especially in areas of fewer resources. And some lingering questions were emerging from looking at this comparison across counties about whether scale or stage of recovery pushes civil society out, and whether disparities tend to be addressed through this assistance or reinforced. And to give you an idea of what this looked like, so sort of the resources that were donated, in our survey, we captured reports of over 7.5 million meals that were provided, over 200,000 gallons of water, 120 tons of ice, over 60,000 items of clothing, 200,000 gallons of fuel. The organizations who took our survey reported managing over 9,000 volunteers who dedicated 1.6 million hours to the work. And we captured over $59 million of cash donations. And we see actually when I put these together, that cash and in-kind gifts were about the same. My suspicion is actually that the volunteer labor piece that looks to be about half as large as the other two, my guess is that goes underreported more than the other two. It might be about equal. So my suspicion is that the actual sort of forms of donations are probably about a third to each of the three categories. And that's just sort of a lack of record keeping with volunteers and sort of figuring out hours and labor, or sort of not taking, answering the survey in the same way. It's easier to keep records on in-kind gifts and especially cash donations, and that has a bias for the reporting. When we look at where these flowed, right, we're starting here, Leon County, right at FSU, and most of the assistance was radiating out from Leon County to other counties. I put a red line on here if we were able to identify at least three organizations based in the county assisting others. The only other major network we're seeing is that Bay County has clusters of organizations that are helping all of its neighboring counties, and that some organizations based in Jackson County were actually helping those in Calhoun. And that's because the two, Jackson and Calhoun, were actually part of the same long-term recovery group. So they created a joint one with each other. And so that sort of assisting one another was part of what they were doing. The other interesting dynamic is that these organizations went to those that they were already comfortable with. They went to religious organizations, they went to nonprofits in the community to help coordinate the distribution of their donations. They did not go as often to the organizations we generally anticipate being formally designated for coordinating these efforts. Quite a few did reach out to the Red Cross, but only 10 organizations reported engaging with local government to help coordinate it, despite the fact that local governments are supposed to be the go-to organizations for coordinating voluntary assistance after a disaster. And so what we learned from looking at this donation and sort of how organizations chose, we found that more in-kind groups emerged could potentially be viewed as a problem rather than an asset by professional emergency responders. A lot of these respondents that were providing in-kind gifts were very small and providing it perhaps to just one county. There wasn't much of a consistent pattern on what type of organizations engage in collaboration that are providing either cash or volunteers, which was a little disappointing. Most of the groups are driven by mission or impact. Government and corporate responders tend to be very localized and small scale, which isn't all that surprising. Governments are restricted in what they're allowed to do. Corporations are going to respond to sort of where their consumers are, where their organizations are. And I was also observing, looking at these patterns, that religious groups and secular nonprofits appear to operate in divergent clusters. Most of the time they aren't in the same groups, aren't sort of motivated in the same way, driven to respond in the same way. What this can tell us is we can start to look for sort of profiles of types of donors when we're trying to build disaster response networks. There are types of organizations that it looks like are not frequently captured in sort of the advanced networks we build for this. The others sort of recognize the role of organizations that have clear preferences for the type of assistance they can provide. So I've pointed out in the previous literature, and I heard this from emergency managers quite a bit, is that dealing with volunteer labor, dealing with donated supplies becomes a burden, right, rather than an advantage. And part of that is sort of not having the pre-existing connections to be able to find these organizations that are going to respond and mobilize them in a way that makes sense. And then we want to start to get into some of this in the future, investigate the underlying logic of donor organizations, why they tend not to be engaged in collaborations. And then just generally, it raises the idea that there's a potential mismatch between the timing and form of donations compared to the existing structures for coordinating them. They just don't seem to align particularly well, and that might be part of the problem that we're seeing. So the last thing I wanted to introduce, where we've started, the most recent thing, we've started to sort of fill in the gaps by looking at some of the other economic impacts and activities. And so we're trying to figure out the other sources of recovery assistance. So I've been working with some students. We've so far identified what appear to be over $4 billion worth of federal contracts in the wake of Hurricane Michael. We're still tinkering with that. It's possible some of them are tangential to Hurricane Michael rather than directly related to the rebuilding efforts. And so we're trying to narrow those down. And a lot of them are tied into the work in Bay County because the Air Force Base there, Tyndall Base, was so badly damaged and had to be rebuilt. But we're seeing that over 80% of these contracts went to Bay County. The remaining 17% or so, 19%, are scattered across the impacted region and even beyond. Most of them are going for administrative support and waste management. That's a mix of things like dealing with debris hauling and what I suspect is just sort of not great reporting on which sector is actually doing the work. I think the administrative support probably ends up as a catch-all for a lot of things that may actually fit better somewhere else. 17% are explicitly to the construction sector, and the remainder are sort of all other industry sectors. In comparison, the grants, so sort of the assistance to households and to individuals and to local governments, are much smaller. So FEMA, we had sort of over $600 million from them, but we've also identified another 90 million in federal grants from other agencies. We're still sort of tinkering, working with that data, sort of broader range. In comparison, so with philanthropy, we've identified about $150 million of philanthropy. My estimates are that I've probably captured about half of it, or up close to that. So it may be as much as $300 million that we got from philanthropy. We haven't started the process yet for collecting the state grants and contracts. We're sort of working on that. Early on, an early figure of it was about the $250 million range was what the state was expecting to use for the recovery. I don't know yet, and I'm trying to figure out the best sources for looking at insurance settlements and private investment for the full scale of all the different sectors in their response to it. So one of the things that really came out when we started analyzing this is the challenge for targeting. So if we look before the storm, Bay County, of the severely impacted counties, so not including here in Leon County clearly sort of has some advantages that even Bay doesn't. But it had the smallest percentage of its population who had some measure of vulnerability, economic, health, otherwise. In this impacted region, Gadsden County had the largest percentage. And it was a significant difference depending on which metric we're using. And yet the vast majority of recovery assistance went to Bay County. We saw with the contracts, it was north of 80%. It's not all that different if we look at the philanthropy or if we look at the other government grants. In those two areas, we're still talking about more than half of all of it being designated or targeted for Bay County. And yet, if we look at the sort of the total population, Bay County is only about 1/3 of the population of the impacted region. If we adjust for sort of how severely they're hit by the storm, maybe as much as half of the sort of severely impacted population is in Bay County, but probably less than that. And so we are seeing that after the disaster, Bay County was much more successful in getting assistance to rebuild and getting recovery assistance, despite having fewer pre-existing challenges facing them. And sort of, yeah, it is the much greater levels of prior vulnerability and poverty haven't really been addressed. And that's an interesting dynamic to observe, because one of the things each of these counties were trying to do in their recovery was both sort of address the immediate response from the disaster, but also think about using this recovery as a way to try to address some of their lingering problems. So Gadsden County had a huge housing problem before the storm. And so as they were using the recovery, as they were trying to secure grants and outside assistance, there was a concentrated effort to think about how do we rebuild our community so we have more housing available for our citizens. I directly observed debates in another county where they started, the long-term recovery group there actually started debating sort of the degree to which they were trying to meet the needs of their most impoverished versus trying to have economic development and rebuilding. That in their discussion, it set off sort of the appearance of concerns about gentrification, although they didn't use the term, but they were sort of discussing what this would look like after the disaster. And then Bay County sort of built out and moved toward a full-blown sort of long-term economic development and recovery plan, and then trying to secure as much external assistance from a wide range of sources as possible in order to build back a sort of stronger economy. So I wanted to leave plenty of room for questions, for discussion, feedback. So I'm open for any of your questions or anything I can share further.
Anyone can go ahead and just unmute and ask their questions directly if they want, or if you don't have any audio capabilities, you can put them in the chat.
Hi, Dr. Berlan. Thank you so much for coming and giving this talk. My question is pretty simple. So like none of this information isn't really recorded. The information, especially about like insurance settlements and like FEMA payouts and stuff, neither of those are like, neither of those have data centralized in any location by the government or by any agency or anything. Like you are exclusively like collecting all of this data, and like, is that how that's going?
FEMA reports its stuff. So FEMA's data is centralized. They do reports after the disasters. I have noticed that sort of how comprehensive and useful their information is depends in part on how much attention the disaster is given and sort of how well resourced a county is. I, sat in on some calls, participated on some things, and I was shocked at sort of the divergence in how much information even sort of the professional managers had for what the impacts look like in Bay County compared to the other counties. So they would spend 20 minutes talking about what they knew about the impact in Bay County, and then sort of the people targeted with the rest of the region had about 5 minutes of information. And that's an interesting dynamic. The others, there are some publicly accessible information. Other things are still not quite settled. Insurance settlements take more than a year to figure out. They're not comprehensively reported, at least I can tell in one place, although I'm trying to dig into things like the reinsurance, was that Florida Peninsula? Here in Florida, that sort of reinsures the other insurers to try to capture that for a sort of a more comprehensive or what figures they have. Private investment, unless it's getting reported by these counties as sort of like a bragging point, that's not something we traditionally track clearly and easily. to be able to tie to a disaster, right? I'm hoping there will be some follow-up, at least in Bay County, sort of how they've built up this very comprehensive recovery plan. They had about a 300-page recovery plan that they put out with all the projects they wanted to fund, where they were planning to get the sources to. That's sort of the only really comprehensive plan that was out there for sort of what these counties needed. The reality is the others just didn't, frankly, have the capacity to do that type of thing, even on a much smaller scale. You know, I was collecting the data 6 months to a year after the storm, and most of these counties were just starting to get people out into the field to try to figure out what needs remained, right? So they didn't even really have a concrete needs assessment, which was a fascinating contrast with Bay County. They had hired 2 different consulting firms that were specialists in emergency management. They had done processes to try to get citizen feedback, but they were also doing things like starting to hit people with fines for not cleaning up their debris sort of just months after the storm, and sort of other dynamics there too that were intriguing. The others at the state level, the data is fragmented, and that's problematic. So federal, we started with federal because at least we do have grants.gov, and we have contracts databases, so they do have sort of comprehensive information. It's even that has flaws and problems. We have to spend a lot of time cleaning it to be confident in what we found, but at least there it's available. For the philanthropy, nobody collects that, and that's sort of why I was doing that. There's a little bit of reporting that is done through the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and through the Chamber of Commerce actually collects a little bit about disasters, but the Chamber of Commerce is basically just collecting press releases from corporations where they're self-reporting what they did, and that's sort of about the extent of what really gets captured. Counties that are doing their work effectively probably have some degree of a census on what was done philanthropically, because they can use donations, in-kind support, volunteer labor to count toward their matching requirements for FEMA assistance. So they're even incentivized to be doing this, and yet really don't do a great job of capturing this information.
Thank you. And a follow-up, if I may. How do you think that we can ensure that the smaller counties have administrative capacities to figure out what they need after a storm effectively? Like, do you think that federal or state grants should come down and aid in hiring of consulting firms, or what do you think would be like the most effective based on perhaps your knowledge of all of these systems that you figured out in the course of your research?
Yeah, so part of that, I want to do some follow-up work. So my plan actually, when travel's permitted again, right? Things I can be back out in the field is to follow up with these long-term recovery groups and sort of interview the people that were doing this to get a better sense of what they had available and what they needed. What I saw that was available to them immediately was a lot of training and a push to create these brand new organizations to collaborate and to coordinate. So they got plenty of free training, but the problem is you're cobbling this together from a relatively small community, right? And the model is there's, what are there, like 8 different clusters at FEMA after a disaster that they're supposed to sort of staff up to cover all of it or run committees for. The reality, you've got Liberty County has 10,000 people. You're not going to be able to staff 8 subcommittees of a new nonprofit effort from a population of 10,000, right? It's not feasible. So yeah, coming up with money to hire somebody to do this type of organizing work, right? To put that in place would make a lot of sense and be really cheap relative to sort of what we spend on disasters. Instead of sort of having this expectation that the people who have formally been tasked with this responsibility in a local community, plus sort of the civil society around them, can handle it. The reality is they really can't, and it doesn't necessarily align all that well with what they want to be doing. You've got people who want to be out there just helping people. That's why they agreed to join these groups. That's why they're involved. being able to bring in a consultant or a nonprofit professional from another community who has experience in this area, right? There are lots of people who could fit that bill and would be willing to do it. And I think sort of having a way to hire them and mobilize them would be ideal.
Thank you.
And part of it too, I would guess, in this, maybe those of you who are a little bit more of emergency management experts than I might sort of feel as well, is it seems there's a bit of what I would call a donut hole here, in that the response, right? The immediate response, there is a professionalized community that does this. And for economic development, there is the same. If your community is large enough, there are interests that will get involved in economic recovery and investing and planning, but in the middle, sort of as we meet the housing needs for people, as we meet other remaining needs for people in the community that have grown a lot relative to what communities normally address, we don't really have designated actors who take responsibility for that.
Hey, Dr. Berlan. So I guess one thing I could throw in is I did some research with Florida State, UF, and Georgia Tech for the Center of Economic Forecasting and Analysis on the Hurricane Michael issue. One of the things that we found out, like we started off with like insurance, like you said, it's difficult to find granular information. The Florida Office of Insurance Regulation had some pretty good data collected, but the issue I ran into was like Allstate, State Farm, any of the big private home insurance companies have an exemption where they don't have to report their data to the state anymore, but they still get it somehow, but they don't report specifically. So that was a good resource for me. But one of the things we switched to in the debris recovery, the cost of it, that's one thing I focused on. And obviously from economics, when you have a disaster like this, you're gonna have an increased demand for supplies, drives up the price. One of the issues I looked into was using recycled materials for reconstruction versus virgin materials, which would cost more money. The problem in the Panhandle, you only have one recycling center that can make these products. It's in Leon County. The rest of the state, the southeast portion of the state is filled with these, but the Panhandle, there's only one location. So those transportation costs back and forth from the counties to Leon County is crazy, but it's not economically incentivized because like the tippage fee to dispose of it is so low up here in the Panhandle that people would rather just throw away the debris than recycle it. I just want to see if there's any thoughts you had on that process.
I mean, I think that's it's similar to a lot of the challenges here, right? Is that because this is such a rural community with a couple of population centers, we have very little in the way of infrastructure that we could rely on, right? Yeah, coming just here for recycling, but it even meant sort of the things like having enough trucks to be able to do the hauling fast enough wasn't really feasible, and that's part of what sort of made the debris hauling, things like that, linger for so long. Is every truck that could do that work was tied up for a year and a half in the area doing it and sort of prioritizing where they could get paid the best rate first. And that's why we were really concerned for like the year after about whether the wildfire season was going to be really awful because it was taking so long to follow up with that. Yeah, that, it doesn't surprise me. And it is an interesting challenge. One of the things I also found fascinating was just sort of the range of rates that they were able to secure to get debris hauled. When I pulled up their estimates and sort of their data from the counties and the reports, it was quite the range for how they were doing it.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I got one more.
Okay.
So we also I think the team from Georgia Tech was looking into using drones for damage estimates and things like that right after the storm hits. Like compared to using government, resources, Navy, Coast Guard, things like that, the marginal cost was so much lower to use like commercial drones. And one of the issues we saw was local amateur groups, as you called them, were getting good data, But the problem was communicating it to the other organizations, whether it's federal or the professional organizations, and that information sharing was really difficult. Any suggestions on how that can be improved or anything like that?
I mean, yeah, this does get to the elements of our federalism system, right? Where everything is localized, everything reverts to the local level. And it means that we're often reinventing the wheel, right? Rather than if we had a single sort of, this is the template for how we report damage impacts, right? In a community, this is where we, you know, a database where we share information. But there are some challenges to it that are problematic. One is people's privacy. So what they actually have to do for damage to housing or people who need philanthropic assistance is they have to anonymize it. They have to have systems built in that whoever collects the information doesn't actually share the individual or the household because people get so concerned about privacy in this region in particular, not wanting to be seen as sort of taking government assistance or sort of needing a handout is a very strong disincentive to report sort of your needs. And so there had to be firewalls basically between those who are out collecting information about who needs assistance and even those groups who made decisions about providing assistance. And so that's a tricky piece of it. There are also sort of incentive issues. So there was one big sort of but one controversy that I discovered was one of the groups that was doing this sort of house-to-house surveying to see where needs were was not willing to share the information with any other organization. And so they had a specific contract for it to provide one particular type of assistance, but they were, even if they couldn't provide the other forms of assistance, they weren't willing to cooperate with the others. And so that dynamic can also be, you know, it can also be self-interest that drives it at times. You know, so we've got a couple of different problems that intersect with each other, right? It's that lack of standardization, that lack of sort of pre-existing ties between groups that makes it easier for us to share information, and then sort of the conflicting interests that we have in place. I don't know what the grading, I mean, the best answer to that is if we had really easy to use templates that were made available, sort of information about how to share it and what form it should be in. It's sort of there for the household level assistance, right? But things like the drone surveys where it might be broader than just household level, you know, I don't think we've created that yet. And so that would be a great thing that hopefully groups are doing. Like our emergency management center right here at FSU does a lot of great work with drones, and they're piloting some of this stuff, and they might be able to, you know, in the future sort of make contributions in that way. But yeah, that would be great. It would speed things up a lot, right, compared to some of the other alternatives.
Dr. Berlan, thank you so much for sharing your research today. I had one question in regards to the future, for future disasters to impact this area. How do you see long-term recovery groups impacted? Do you think that they've learned in a way what to do for future disasters? That, you know, hurricane season's coming up, and I know they've had a struggle still recovering from Hurricane Michael.
Yes, so I mean, they definitely, like the long-term recovery groups that were created, know what to do and will have an easier time of it if another large disaster hits them, right? Hits their community. The big downside though that I'd be concerned about is I don't know how much of their goodwill and sort of their willingness of people to put in time they've burned up already. There were definitely signs of sort of that, I'm forgetting the word, but there's sort of a fatigue for volunteers, for those who are donating their time, that was setting in for even those sort of organizing these groups. Most of them have had a change in leadership in the 2 years they've been running, in part because you probably can't keep doing this, right? For long periods of time, they're moving into an area they're not sort of used to or comfortable with. If we compare the nature of what these long-term recovery groups do to what a lot of the individuals leading them do, is it's not the same, right? Coordinating lots of actors to sort of make sure they're all on the same page and doing things the same way is very different than the experience of somebody who's used to going out there and just say, helping members of their congregation who need assistance, or who are used to providing one specific type of human service. And I worry about, they have the knowledge and the experience. I don't know that they've built up the capacity to really have that time and dedication. I'm sure the same people will come back in and sort of share their experience and donate more time. And but I don't know sort of how well they, I don't know that they've built more of that up.
Thank you.
All right. Seeing no other questions, and since it's almost 7 o'clock, I want to thank our speaker and all of our guests for coming tonight. And I also wanted to draw attention to the chat. That is the sign-up link to join the mailing list for our wonderful co-host organization tonight. So if anybody's interested in going to their future events, please sign up. But that is everything that we have for you today. Thank you for coming. Our next meeting will be in 2 weeks with the same Zoom information. Have a good rest of your night.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here, Professor.